Today's topic will be graph reports, and I'm going to bring the report that we used in the grid report demo. Let me edit it first so you can see what it has. Two attributes in the page by. It has an attribute right here, and it has two metrics and one derived metric, which is cost, and the cost was simply the subtraction or the difference. Okay, so there's nothing fancy about this. It has also a filter for country and a quarter prompt. So if we run this report, it should look simple and make sense. If you want to see how we created this report, just refer to our grid report demo. Okay. So again, here's our simple report that we want to utilize for a graph. So first thing we could do is just go and convert this to a graph and see. So if you get prompted, this is what you will see. If you don't, you could change it manually from graph type. You get all these out of the box graphs available. You can use the area to demonstrate, for example, a stacked progress over time, for instance. You could use the line, which is frequently used to demonstrate scattered data across some axis. You can stack it, or you can create it absolute, meaning that it'll be on top of each other versus always going from the zero. You could show something in a pie or a donut, and again you can go through these. Now the ones that have combination are just pre-built combinations of them. This requires a lot more metrics. I rarely see these. We usually end up creating them on your own as you go rather than using an out-of-the-box combination, just because they're so unique. But you can also utilize them. The custom, these are again, these are specialized. For example, basic, big data sets. This allows you to capture a lot of data. For example, this one is pretty good. Bar percent or something like this, where there's a lot of data and you're just trying to show, kind of capture as much information. The advanced, you will see options like gauge and funnel, and these are good to use, except that you have to know that for example, this is a one metric thing. Same here. So there's some limitations. You have to, you could experiment and figure out. Now remember, these are not Flash components either. There's just the MicroStrategy built-in graphs. Okay, so let's go with the basic for now. I'm going to go vertical. And let's do clustered, see what it looks like. So here it is. It's saying, you still get the page buys. You have three series. You have a cost, revenue, and a profit metric. And you have the 3 quarters that we selected. Okay, so obviously, the number of items that you're displaying, the more items you display, the more congested your graph will look. Notice it resizes automatically as well, and you can manipulate that as well. So let me go over some of the most important options, and then we'll discuss about how to modify things. So the view, insert, and the data component are just like the grid, so I'm not going to cover them here. Go back to the grid report demo and you can see what we talked about, and things start getting different here. So gallery lets you select from the different items that are available for you in MicroStrategy. Okay, they're organized a little bit different, so you can feel free to go and select from here, or the way the traditional way was, and the one I use, is just to go to the graph type and select the one you want. Okay, this gives me a little bit more feel of what I'm getting into. So you could customize your graph and then save the graph style. So let's say your company uses 3 specific colors all the time, or 4. You can change your bars to those colors, save that graph style, and next time you apply a bar or a graph, it'll try to select those colors or that font, etc. Okay. Now the most important thing here is the graph options one. All these, and you can select them individually, are all embedded in this option right here. So I pretty much would say use this all the time. It'll cover everything you need. I don't think you need anything outside this option when you're editing your graphs, except for the graph type. Alright, so the graph option, let's start from the beginning all the way to the end, and I'll talk about most of them. So you saw when we resized that graph, well, because it's selected, font and line sizing are all relative, meaning when I drag, It expands when I shrink. Things try to shrink, so that try to accommodate. See, here's the number of series, number of categories. We have 50. Here's 4 categories that are being displayed. But let's say I had something like 3 and I apply it. Look what happens. One of them gets lost. So if you don't see some of your data in the axis, come here. It might be that you're displaying less categories than needed. So in this case we had a need for 4, but 50 was extra. I typically try to keep those large enough. I would recommend, because there's no penalty. So you could keep them at, something like 100 and 100. Okay, or in the series case, it depends on how your series are built. Okay. All right. So using nested labels, if you have multiple rows of information, it just allows you to sort of merge your labels, your higher level labels or not. And again, suppressing last level labels. These are useful for when you have too many labels. You can suppress last level. I usually suppress last level always, unless I want to display more information at the levels. And this again is useful when you have multiple attributes on your axis. Okay. Showing subtotals in the graph. Do you want to allow that or not? Okay. So let's add subtotals at the total level. Okay, let's add it again. Advanced. It's at the category, which is why it wasn't showing. Let's do it at the quarter level. Alright, so now that we added at the quarter, it knows what we're trying to do. Okay, let's look at this. See this one, the vertical bar options. Depending on the graph you select, you will see different preferences, because this is properties change, the number of axes change, etc. So for the vertical, for example, I'm just going to cover a couple, and then you get the idea. So you can, all the text fields, you can specify, oh yeah, all my text needs to have 10, etc. And it has to be a certain color. Or you can just say, you know what, I don't want to specify it at the alt text. I want to have the titles have their own. So here's my titles, have their own fonts. My axis can have its own font, etc. Or when you do the all, this will overwrite everything down here. Okay, so be careful how you use things. They're organized in order, so that makes sense. Now, you also have the ability to, do you want to increase the gap between these bars, etc. You want to use depth. And in the display, you want to show the legend, and you want it to be by series. Like in this case, series are the metric, so each metric had a different color. Or do you want each quarter, for example, to have its own combination? So it depends on, you want it to go by category or you want it to go by series. Depends on how you lay out things. You can modify some cosmetics related to your legend as well. And the layout, this is really depending on what graph you chose. So let's say you chose bars and later on you didn't want it to be clustered, you want it absolute or percent. You could go ahead and play with that. If you have multiple metrics, you can do dual axis, which allows you to organize your metrics on left and right hand in a bar case. The reason you want to do that dual axis, if your metrics have totally different ranges, then you'll have one bar so small and one bar so large, yet they are not really related, so the ranges don't matter for you. You want to split them in dual axis, so go ahead with the dual axis and split the dual axis between them. If you do that, more properties will pop up, like here, which one do you want on the left, which one do you want on the right. Okay, again, titles, these are the titles, so you can have titles for your axis, for your category, footnote, subtitle, etc. And some of these are automatic, like this, ampersand report name, etc. Some of these just will default to produce your report name, but if you don't care for that, say my graph. Okay. Your axis, again, you have axis, the fonts. In this case, we have a category in the x-axis, and the y-axis are the values. You can specifically go and say, okay, well, I want to show certain grids, and my lines. I want to modify my axis lines, etc. Recolor them. Some of these you will, if you change them, will not be as visible as in the web. So some of these I would recommend some of the coloring items to do it in the web when you're editing a graph, and I'll show you that in a second. Okay. Background, same thing. Your fill and border. These become very handy. I find them very handy when you're embedding graphs into dashboards. Sometimes I like just to go with 100% transparent, so when I drop my graph into a dashboard, I don't have to worry about it bringing its colors with it. Same thing with borders. Keep them at 100%. Again, if you're using this inside a dashboard, you might want to not inherit some of these things and keep it at 100%. So if you apply that, I'm just telling you that, okay, everything is coming back blank. You can edit the legend again. You can give it a separate color, a border, and you can modify the text properties, the font. Okay, the series, in this case, we're 3. Okay, so we have the cost, revenue, profit. Now we could have switched the series around. I'll show you that. But I mean, the idea is each one of them can, besides the fact that you can add data labels to all of them, which might clutter, it depends on what each one of them can have its own color modified, transparency. You can even give it texture, pattern, etc. So you can modify your series separately. Okay, that should cover the basics of these. All right. Now notice this, because this is a bar graph, everything, the chart type was bar. But if you decided, well, you know what, of all of them, I want profit to not be a bar, well, you can say, okay, I want it to be a line or an area. Let's do that. Okay, and then the line properties show up, and when I apply an OK, everything profit becomes a line. Okay, it's just another way. Now everything that we showed you in that in those preferences in the graph options, again, can be found here. All of these will lead you to the same location. For instance, if I click preferences, oh, I'm back in here. Okay. Also, you can click on a certain item and edit it immediately. Again, it'll bring you back into the preferences box, but it'll have it opened where you need to be. So if you're not sure where to find it, if you're not familiar with this menu, just go in the graph, right click, and add. Okay, change this graph again. You want to be careful about what you're doing, because some of these will require some modification. So let's look at pies. So notice here, like each quarter has its own pie, and then the total pie right here. So let's see if we modify this a little bit. Let's go back to grid mode. Wondering, what if I put my quarters up here and my metrics down here? Alright, see, what I did here is I swapped my rows and columns, and now I have a pie just for cost, a pie for revenue, pie for profit, broken by the different quarters. So again, switching columns and rows will allow you to go from series to categories. So now your series are your categories, and your categories are your series. So if you look here, now your quarters are your series, not the metrics. Okay, so again, but you could also manipulate your different series, or your different separately, different colors, etc. And here, notice that now it says pie options, not vertical bar options, because we're using a pie, which is almost the same. So you got the text, but you start getting into the general and say, okay, do you want depth? Do you want it rotated? Do you want to explode it? Let's explode it just a little bit. Okay. Do you want to show the legend? Do you want it to be 2D or not? It depends on what your needs are. Some of these will show better in the web than in the desktop. Do you want it to be a pie or a ring pie? And then you get this Group label, you can change the fonts for the group. Okay. Again, let's just stop here for this. Okay. So you can play with this. You can create your different, visualizations or graphs. Again, I'm not going to cover all of the types, but like I said, some types require more care. Like the bubble will require. Let's see if we can create actually the bubble. So here's the bubble, but if you notice that you only will see this Q because we had it swapped. So let me swap them again. I'm going to just wholesale swap them, see what happens. Alright, let's go back to our graph. Alright, so we have cost, and this is probably my profit, and this is probably my revenue. So you can add axis titles to make it clear which one is which. Let's do that. Why don't we do that? Titles, and my x-axis I'm going to call it revenue, my y profit. Okay, and my bubble options, display, legend, and layout. Okay, so I want to change this to circle. Circle will contain the size of the cost, so it'll be based on the cost. Okay, so here's another example. Now notice what happens here. Because I had 3 metrics, this worked. That's why I said you got to be careful. If I went back to my design view, okay, and took the cost off and had only 2 metrics and tried to create a bubble, it's going to give you an error and say, oh, you need more data. Or go back to my graph mode. It'll give us back, it'll send us back to the default because it couldn't render the bubble. Okay, so these are some considerations you need to be careful of. Other than that, you still can export, you can still add new thresholds. I'll show you the thresholds from the web. They might make more sense. Alright, so with that, let's save this and go to our web and see what happens there. And before I save to the web, I want to show you one more option right here, the drop zones. Let's click on it. See that we had to go, initially I was going back to the graph and swapping, but here you could do it manually. You can actually say, okay, well, I do want my quarter here, and I do not want my metrics there, but I want them down here. So you can start playing around from the drop zones as well. That's available in the web as well. So this is just similar to going to the grid and swapping things around. It depends on your comfort level. I generally work with the grid, adjust it to what I need, and then go to the graph. But some people like to see things on while they're editing. Okay, so let's save this and close. Keep it prompted, filter and template. Okay. Let's bring up our web environment. In our shared environments, in our shared report, sorry, we will find that report that we created. Let us run it and see how it looks like. Okay. Keep the same prompt answers. Just keeping them because it's we're just doing this for demo purposes, but you could change it. Okay, so here was our last report. It's shown our drop zones again because it allows us to modify them if needed. Okay. And again, your page by. Notice here that you still have the formatting option for graph, but it's a lot limited. You'll see what I'm talking about. So here you go. You can change. You can number of category and series item. You have a lot less options to modify or to make changes with. Okay. Maximum, minimum. This comes in handy if you want to eliminate like the 0. Okay, so minimum value, let's say on the Y was, let's say 100,000, and you still want it by set by row or by column, absolute or not, show total or not. Okay, so you only have a few of the options that you had previously. Okay, and you can undo any change, which is pretty cool if you made a mistake. The graph also has a few items in the bar that you just saw in the preferences as well. You want to add data values, you want to remove the legend or keep it, you want to change the type, you want it clustered, etc. And you can change back to the design mode. You also have the ability to make your data modifications and your tool modifications, like add page by, etc. Do you want the graph zones or you want to remove the graph zones, which is also available here. You could do your editing right on the spot, so you can format an item immediately, but again, you're limited at this point. The desktop has a lot more capabilities. You can go into design mode, and you could, modify again further, change your filters, etc. So you still have that capability. However, most designers that want to make the final editing will probably want to run it in graph and make their changes here so that they can modify things on the fly. Okay, and you can, obviously you still inherit all the drilling, or you can create your own drill map just like a report. Let's show you one last thing before we move on, the thresholds. So if you can go to Advanced Threshold Editor, and let's just create one on revenue. Say we're greater than or equal to 400. Apply it. Change the format. Double click. And what I'm going to do is going to change the color to a new color called purple. Okay. Click on this. There's this graph icon. I have to enable it for the threshold to work, and then go back. Alright, so everything that was over 4,000, it didn't apply for the subtotal, but if you wanted it to apply to the subtotal or the total, just go back here. Again, click on it and say subtotal, and now everything gets highlighted, or the threshold works for everything. Okay, obviously we didn't have any item that was less, so that's why we didn't see, or we saw everything turn into purple, but you get the point here. Again, you can change while you're here, so let's go change to pi and see what it looks like. There we go. And you can enable your or switch your series if you want, like we showed you in the web as well. You can do it from here, and you can reformat texts, you can change items on the fly. You want to add something like, what was it, the bubble will get the error because it's saying, oh, it's not a sufficient data, but you can go back to design mode and make the change. And in this case we said, okay, let's add the cost to our metrics. And let me drag our metrics into series and then run it. Alright, so here we go. We see our bubbles now because we have a third, which was the cost. You could change the order of these, and then, I think if you do this, it might not change it for you, but let's see what happens. So now the revenue becomes your size, and then the purple is still because of the filter. So it is purple just because the threshold, not because it's not revenue. Same thing here. If we drag revenue down here, or profit up there. So there's all these things that you can play with depending on the type of graph that you choose. These are not interactive. They can be embedded in dashboards as is. We will have another session for custom visualizations which allow these to become interactive, such as Flash or Ajax. Okay, cover that in a different demo, and thanks again.